Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm watching The American Civil War by Oversimplified. Before we even start, I do have to say, I'm not an American. I don't know that much about US history. So to any Americans watching, please don't lose your shit if I get something wrong, okay? This is oversimplified. It's an oversimplified version of the events that actually happened. So not everything is going to be completely accurate, not everything is going to be mentioned, because that's not the point here. These videos are just to get you interested in the topic. I will get some things wrong. That's inevitable. So, now that we're clear, let's actually get to watching the video. Link to the original videos will of course be down in the description below.
Okay, Mrs. Lincoln, this is it. One last push, and we're done.
There he is.
9 months and 4 days ago, my father brought forth upon my mother himself, and gave to her a child, conceived in a shack in Kentucky, and dedicated to the proposition that I will drink num-nums from a bottle and do little poo-poos in my pantses for the next 2 to 3 years. Now what is it babies do again?
Cry.
I am not touching that. Abraham Lincoln grew up with his relatively poor family in Kentucky, eventually
I did
moving
not
to
know he
Indiana,
was from
and
Kentucky.
finally, Illinois. He read a lot of books, worked a lot of jobs, wrote some questionable poetry, and finally read a lot of books, worked a lot of jobs, wrote some questionable.
Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen I wrote the same. I wrote in both haste and speed, and left in here for fools to read. And left it here for fools to read. I mean, it's not good, but it's not terrible.
Poetry, and finally entered the law profession. Despite being self-taught, he turned out to be a pretty clever and astute lawyer. In one case, a guy claimed he witnessed a murder at night, and Lincoln was like, "How could you have seen anything in the dark? There was a bright full moon." A what? A bright full moon. Can you say that again, please? There was a bright full moon. A dim half moon? No, a bright full moon. That's funny, because according to this almanac, there was a dim half moon that night, which makes you a liar. Well, I got a bright full moon for y'all right here. Now that's what I call a rebuttal. Lincoln and his cheekbones weren't only interested in law, however. He also dabbled in the world of politics, serving as a legislator in both local and national assemblies. And what a time it was. Not even 100 years after the Founding Fathers wrote, "All men are created equal," politicians were already asking,
Biggest lie ever.
but what does that mean exactly? It means all men.
Yep.
Yeah, but what does that mean exactly? And not just that. States' rights versus the federal government. What are the executive powers of the president? Is cereal a soup? The Founding Fathers left some of these questions perhaps a little too open to interpretation. And the biggest question of them all was slavery, an ugly mark on what should have been a revolutionary new nation based on liberty and democracy. Thomas Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of
Really?
losing Southern states' support, it was removed. Hey guys,
Oh.
do you think leaving this a little vague will create any unforeseen problems in the future? Cannonball! And those unforeseen problems were now beginning to rear their ugly heads. As the nation developed, the North and the South developed along two very different lines, and two very different cultural identities emerged. Northern cities began rapidly industrializing, while the southern climate allowed for large plantations of labor-intensive crops.
So,
As
of
a
course,
result,
slavery.
one half of the country didn't rely on slaves, while the other half had become economically dependent on them. In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode, while in the North, a growing abolitionist movement was taking root. A general mistrust began to develop between the North and the South, as Northerners felt the South were hell-bent on expanding slavery, and fear spread throughout the South that the North wanted to take their slaves away. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. A perfect balance. A happy medium.
What about all
a
the land
harmonious
out west?
relationship. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Missouri, and I would like to become the 23rd state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a free state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. Missouri's gonna be a slave state. Okay, listen.
God, this
why don't
really
we
just
ask
feels like
Missouri
the
what
US
it wants to be,
election.
and we slave state. Well, then.
Guess it's a good thing I'm
allow
watching
me
this
to
right now.
introduce to you the newest, freshest state on the scene, Maine. Hey, you can't do that, and you can't have any more slave states above this line. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. You see, as America
More
expanded
states?
westward, each new state or territory that was added threatened to upend the delicate balance between the slave and free states. If one faction managed to outnumber the other, it could gain an easy majority and force its own ideals on the opposing side, leaving a huge portion of the population
So they wanted to keep it
feeling
equal,
spiteful
basically, just
and
to
oppressed.
so no
For a
one can
while,
gain an upper
compromises
hand.
kicked the can down the road and kept the volatile balance in check, as new free and slave states were roughly added in pairs. But then one loudmouth state just had to barge in and ruin everything
Texas?
as usual. The addition of Texas saw the United States enter into
That's
a war
a
with
way
Mexico,
bigger Texas
which they
than the
won,
current one.
gaining a huge amount of land out west and creating even more problems. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm California, and I would like to become the 31st state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a
Which
southern
side
slave
did they
state.
choose?
Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. California is going to be a free state. Okay, listen. Why don't we just ask California what it wants to be, and we can free state? Well, then.
Okay, well that was...
Allow me to introduce to you the
I was kinda hoping
territories
there
of
would be
New
a slave
Mexico and
state.
Utah, able to freely vote for slavery themselves. Hey, you can't do that. And we
Would
can
be funny
explode the
considering
territory
how
anytime we
California
want
is
to
today.
recapture escaped slaves. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. In 1854, a Democratic senator from Illinois wanted to build a really cool choo-choo train here and proposed that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska be created open to slavery, even though they were clearly above the Missouri Compromise line. Obviously, the northern states were like, hell no. But the southern Democrats who controlled Congress at the time were like, well, if you love liberty and...
Wait.
But the clearly above the Missouri Compromise line. Obviously, the northern states were like, hell no. But the southern Democrats who controlled Congress at the time
Wait,
were like,
Southern
well, if
Democrats?
you love liberty and democracy so much, then you should let them vote on whether slavery
So the
should be legal
Democrats
or
were the
not."
slave
And
states?
so it was. Huge numbers
Wow.
of pro and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas to sway the vote in their favor. And while they were all there, they began to beat the crap out of each other. One of those settlers was a man named John Brown, a former businessman who failed at just about everything he tried and went arguably insane. He was a radical abolitionist and dedicated much of his
Jesus.
life to the Underground
What a
Railroad
beard.
and freeing slaves. One night, in revenge for an earlier raid by pro-slavery forces, he and his sons killed a number of pro-slavery settlers in the territory, helping to kickstart years of violence known as Bleeding Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska both eventually voted in favor of outlawing slavery. But from here, the tension began to grow at a rapid pace. In 1852, author Harriet Beecher Stowe penned Uncle Tom's Cabin, a best-selling novel that exposed the terrible cruelty of slavery to the world. Oh, how awful. How morally corrupt
No
the
one's
nation must
going to
be
care.
to allow such things to happen. Your Majesty, what should we do about all the starving children working in the coal mines? Nothing! In
See?
1854, the Republican Party was formed, and Abraham Lincoln emerged as a leading figure. Southern Democrats
Wait, Lincoln was head of the Republican Party. Oh, with the way things are today, you would think that the Democrats are anti-slavery and the Republicans would be pro. But it was actually the other way around. That's interesting.
viewed the new Republican Party with mistrust, believing it to be radical and abolitionist. In 1856, a politician named Charles Sumner gave a speech in Congress, calling out slave-owning Democrats with fiery language. If slavery was a woman, she'd be an ugly one. And the senator from South Carolina would like to boink her. Representative Brooks, do you have a rebuttal? Oh, I have a rebuttal, all right.
She's gonna
here's a
hit
rebuttal
him?
for you. Oh, come on. Surely this isn't allowed. I don't know. I'll have to consult the rulebook.
There's probably nothing about them beating each other up.
I can't find anything about caning a political opponent, but it says here I'm not allowed to wear women's underwear. Uh-oh. News of the violence on the Senate floor took the nation by storm. Southern slave owners sent Representative Brooks new canes to replace his now broken one. And on the floors of Congress, politicians carried weapons in self-defense, which is
No
never
way.
a good sign. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that all people of African descent, slave or free, could not be citizens, and therefore could not sue for their own freedom under any circumstances, undoing years of progress with the strike of a gavel. Now, within all this bitter debate over slavery, there were many nuances. North versus South, Republican versus Democrat, states versus the federal government. But let's strip all of that away. For 4 million individuals living in America, this wasn't about political intrigue or party alignment. It was about the basic human right to be free. Men, women, and children were stolen from their homelands and brought to the American continent, where for generations they were considered to be property, forced to live in poverty, and work from sunrise to sunset. Plantation overseers did whatever they felt was necessary to get the most out of their slaves. Punishments were often barbaric. Families were regularly separated, and parents could often only watch, as their children were auctioned off, never to be seen again. Thousands of slaves took the treacherous risk of running away, and abolitionists in the North helped many escape via the Underground Railroad, as bounty hunters entered the North to
I've heard
chase them
something
down.
about the Underground
Leading figures within the
Railroad before.
abolitionist movement included many significant free black men and women. But it's important to note that for many of the anti-slavery white individuals in the North, opposition to slavery was often an economic issue, not a moral one, as many worried
Yeah, that
large
makes sense.
plantations would take their lands and livelihoods away. Abraham Lincoln
Those plantations do bring in income, so if they lose their slaves, they effectively might lose their source of income. So in that situation, it would be more about economics than morality. I did kind of bring this point up when I watched his video about the American Revolution. No, not that one. The video about the pig war, because he talked about the Civil War, something about that, about how the British wanted the sudden supply of cotton and how they were helping the Democrats, the southern states, to some degree. To me, that makes perfect sense, because why would the British care about the way that the product is made? They're buying it. They don't care if it's made by slaves, free people, whatever. They just want the product. I mean, think about how much of the stuff we use today is made by other people's suffering. The phone I'm using to record this with, it's made in China, probably by some poor underpaid worker. Do I care? Kind of, but not really, because it's not like anything I do is going to change it, so what's the point, you know? Nothing's going to change, it's going to be that way, so why even bother?
Lincoln knew that slavery was a moral evil, and he regularly spoke out against it in powerful speeches that helped him rise through the ranks of the new Republican Party. He lamented at the hypocrisy of a great American nation meant to stand as a shining beacon of freedom while also enslaving 4 million men, women, and children. He most famously declared in 1858 that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that one day slavery in America would end. However, even Lincoln was cautious in his opposition. He didn't want to outlaw it entirely, but simply prevent its expansion, so that given enough time, he believed it would naturally die out. Thankfully, history would force his hand. In October 1859, one abolitionist decided he'd try to single-handedly take down slavery by
It's this
force.
guy again.
Who would be crazy enough to even attempt such a thing? It's our good friend, John Brown. He planned to seize arms from an armory in the town of Harper's Ferry, free the slaves there, and continue south, inciting a major slave uprising along the way. A noble cause, a bad plan, and terrible execution. Brown's men took the armory and some hostages, but were quickly surrounded by one Robert E. Lee and his U.S. Marine.
Well, he's done for.
Brown was captured, and a couple of months later, he was executed for treason. Northerners sympathized with Brown, but Southerners were like, you see this? They're coming for us. Soon, there'll be 1 million John Browns. 1 million John Browns? What on earth are you
Of course, it's all about the
a
money.
John Brown farm? Yeah, me too. To make matters worse, new northern free states meant now the southern states really were outnumbered, and they were beginning to feel bitterly spiteful and oppressed. Further fear began to spread in the South when news broke that a relatively unknown figure had just secured the Republican Party nomination for president. Abraham
He's gonna
Lincoln,
take our
mostly
slaves.
well-liked among anti-slavery Northerners, had made some of the most powerfully worded speeches against slavery of any politician at the time. And now, there was a chance that he, and his cheekbones, could become president. For the South, that would be too much. In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. But much to their horror, when the final results came in, Lincoln had won by an
he
electoral
won.
college landslide. Lincoln himself tried to calm their fear. How many times do I have to tell you, I'm not gonna take away your slaves? Yeah, right, Honest Abe. We've had enough of you Northerners. We're gonna go form our own country. You can't do that. Why not?
I mean, technically they can.
If you had won the election, would it be okay for
Just
us
secede
to
from
leave?
the Union.
Of course not. Well, why not? Because that's not how victim mentality works. Many states felt that when they joined the Union, they always withheld the right to leave it whenever they pleased. Many people living in 19th century America often felt more loyalty to their state than to the nation. And now, with the South feeling like it had lost its voice in the federal government, they were out of here. South Carolina was the first to go, and over a period of 6 months, one by one, 11 slave states officially seceded from the Union.
I mean,
with
honestly, I
just
can't
4
blame 'em.
contested border states opting to remain. The seceding states issued a number of official documents justifying their secession. South Carolina proclaimed that it was northern states' hostility to slavery.
I wonder how that would go down today. What would a state have to do in 2024 to actually leave the United States. I highly doubt that's going to happen because I don't see any reason why any state would leave. But, I mean, theoretically it's possible.
That rendered the federal government illegitimate. Mississippi declared that their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. And in a speech, the Confederate vice president stated that the new Confederate government rested upon what he called the great truth of racial inequality. Revered American generals, such as Robert E. Lee, opted to side with their states over the Union. And with all the chaos, one New York lawyer wrote that rather than a bald eagle, America's national bird should be a debilitated chicken. And hey, I kind of like that.
That would actually fit very well for today, for today's United States.
Lincoln was just about to hop on a train and become the President of the United States of America. Hey man, you're hella ugly. Grow a beard or something to hide that face. Good idea.
Still ugly.
Still ugly. With assassination plots already underway, Lincoln had to travel to Washington, D.C. under heavy disguise and protection. All along the way, he received stacks of threatening letters. May the hand of the devil strike you down. You are destroying this country. Damn you, every breath
Sounds
you
like
take.
what...
Love from... Grandma? At his inauguration
Sounds like what
speech,
people tell
Lincoln
American
once again
presidents
reiterated
today
that,
whenever they get
"No,
elected.
I do not want to take away
No matter from
anyone's
which side,
slaves."
Democrat or Republican.
But for Lincoln, he did want to preserve the Union. He declared secession to be nothing but an illegitimate rebellion. In your hands and not in mine, he said, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. It was clear Lincoln was ready and willing to get freaky and
Well,
open
they
up
don't
can of
see you
Statman
as
John if
friends.
he had to. Whether he had the support of the people, however, was in question. In the end, it was the Confederates that fired the first shot. As they seceded, the Confederate states began seizing federal U.S. property
What's with the
throughout
state
the
above
South.
Texas?
Off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, was one such federal property, Fort Sumter, held by a measly, undersupplied U.S. force. The Confederate militia there demanded the fort surrender, a request which was quickly denied, and any remaining hope for a peaceful solution to the secession crisis probably then died when the Confederates did this.
Why would you
Battle
do
of
that?
Fort Sumter is considered to be the beginning of the American Civil War. Many of the Confederates there also considered it to be the end of the American Civil War. They hoped Old Abe would just sigh and say, "Okay, you win."
Yeah,
Unfortunately
I'm
for
sure
them,
that's gonna
Lincoln
happen.
actually said, "You're about to get a roundhouse to the face." Lincoln sent out the call for 75,000.
There's no way he said that.
"You're about to get a roundhouse to the face."
Yeah,
Lincoln
he
sent
did.
out the
It's a
call for
joke.
75,000 volunteers. and
It's hard
men
to tell with
signed up
Americans
in
what's a joke and
droves,
what they
hopeful
actually
for
did
some
say.
adventure and good old-fashioned F-U-N. In the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia,
Fun.
Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cheekbones had also sent out the call for 100,000 men. As ever, both sides hoped for a quick end to the war. Is it over yet? No, Jimmy. It's been 1 week. Is it over now? No. How about now? If you ask that one more time, I swear I will turn
I
this
will
army
turn this-
around,
oh,
and you'll
army.
all have to go back
I'll
home to
turn
your
this
wives
army
and
around.
children. But in
Yeah, why would they be
Virginia,
sad
the
about
South of
that?
the conflict would pose a bit of a challenge.
Who
How
wants
can
to
we
go to
expect
war?
to win with a population of only 5 million against 22 million in the north? If you count us 4 million slaves,
Well,
got
you have 9
million.
million.
Great idea. Hand these rifles out to all the men. Wait a minute.
Oh, yeah, that's...
You almost had me there. The
That's
problem
risky.
for Lincoln was that many of his top generals were getting old and were being a bit too cautious. The commanding general was a man named Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American
Oh, yeah, it's
and
the
by
guy
now,
from,
he was
the
too fat
Pig War.
to even mount a horse. Okay, chaps, we need to come up with a plan.
So wait,
Hit me.
wasn't
We
Harney
could wait for
a
the Confederates to come and
Democrat?
apologize. Maybe we should all sit in a circle and discuss our feelings.
Was his name
Crossing
Harney?
the Delaware into New Jersey worked for me. Those are all terrible ideas. And you? Wrong video. Hey, I'm the greatest president in the history of this nation. Yeah, we'll see about that.
I don't
Davis.
even know who that
Eventually,
is, to be
Lincoln's
honest.
generals came up with a multi-pronged strategy. First, a blockade would cut off and starve the South of supplies by sea. Secondly, taking control of the great Mississippi River would sever the South's economic artery while splitting it in two. And finally, a main Union force in the east would move south and take the Confederate capital, ending the war. Bada boom, bada bing. Skirmishes began
It's
to
not
break
going
out
to be that
across the
easy.
nation, and the Union Army in the east began to move south towards Richmond. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached Manassas, where they came
Washington
upon a
is
large
right on the
Confederate
border.
force. It's almost like they were waiting for us. How did they know? As it turned out, spies in D.C. had sent a coded message
Traitors?
to the Confederates
Yep.
warning of the invasion. Did you use NordVPN? What the
Ah,
heck is
of course, it's a
NordVPN?
sponsor segment.
So glad you asked. Secession, Fat Man, and the Union invasion into Virginia. The two sides encountered each other at Manassas, and both geared up for the first major battle of the Civil War. The First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates rapidly brought in support via rail, and the two sides were about equal in numbers. However, they were also equally inexperienced. A large number of civilians also
most of
rode
them
out
were
by
just
carriage from
conscripts?
DC to picnic on the nearby hills and watch the excitement unfold. Nobody seemed
Seriously?
to quite understand how destructive this war was going to be. The Union forces pulled a flanking maneuver to hit the Confederates on their left, and the two sides fired on each other in rows. Farm families living in the area.
I can't imagine that, just standing in a row and firing, knowing you're about to die when the enemy shoots back. That's crazy to me. That's how warfare went down at some point. You would just face each other, knowing you are gonna get shot next. That's crazy.
Area were forced to flee the fighting, including a man named
That
William
takes some serious balls.
Hurry up, Martha.
And a very
There's war
small
out here.
brain.
The more you tell me to hurry up, the slower I will go. The Union force saw initial success pushing the Confederates back to Henry Hill. But one as of yet fairly unknown General Thomas Jackson had arrived, and he took a defensive position, standing firm like a stone
Jackson,
wall,
I feel like I've
holding
heard that
the
name
Union Army
before.
off, and finally sending them running back to Washington, D.C. With heavy casualties, the sobering reality of war hit both sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major
casualties
battle,
seem
had
about-
the fate of war hit both
Casualties seem about equal. Well, if you don't look at the missing, because then the Republicans definitely lost way more.
sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major battle, had to face the serious prospect that they may not actually win this war. President Lincoln, General Jackson whipped us so hard, the Confederates are calling him Stonewall Jackson. Wait, that's why they're calling him that? Not because he looks like he ran face first into a stone wall? Apparently not. Worse yet, the North had also lost the first major battle out west, giving away control of southwest Missouri. All of this was terrible news for Abraham Lincoln, especially since many of his generals and cabinet already didn't have much
Well,
respect
they won
for
in
him.
the
They
end.
felt he was incapable of running a war, because he seemed a bit like your friendly old grandpa. He famously loved a long-winded story and a good pun. I've been so busy, my wife is missing me. But her aim is starting to improve. But deep down, few realized he could also be incredibly shrewd. Oh, Abe, you're so funny. Funny how? Funny like I'm a clown? Abe, I was just... No, funny how? Like I'm here to amuse you? During the war, Lincoln committed acts that were viewed by some as impeachable. His administration suppressed the free media from printing articles sympathetic towards the South. Some Southern sympathizers were even arrested without a trial. Lincoln's criticizers began accusing him of being a tyrant. But to quote the man himself, hey, it's
Good
war,
old
baby.
censorship.
What are you gonna do? By the end of 1861,
That's true.
with things already looking
There's
bad
no
for the
such thing
North,
as rules in war.
abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass couldn't believe that the Union Army weren't enlisting black men. He continued to put pressure on Lincoln to make the war about emancipation. Mr. President,
You're black,
it's time to
you
make the
can't
war about
enlist.
emancipation.
Sounds pretty good to
I don't
me.
want to ruffle any feathers. The feathers are already ruffled. But Lincoln, hanging on to hope for a quick end to the conflict, continued to fight only
I mean, I
for the
get why they
preservation
want
of
to
the
go
Union.
to war.
It
It's
was
because they're
decided,
fighting
however,
for their
that
rights,
escaped
but
slaves
still.
from the Confederacy could be held as
Not
enemy
being
contraband,
able
and
to
many of these
even
men were put
enlist
to work
sounds
bolstering
pretty
the
good
Union's
to me.
infrastructure and supply lines. Hoping to get things moving, Lincoln made young General George McClellan the new commanding general, and McClellan began to train up his men. He thought a lot of himself, however, and believed he was going to be the nation's great savior. And like many others, he didn't approve
So I'm
of the
guessing he did
president's handling
nothing.
of the war. On one occasion, Lincoln went to McClellan's house to meet with him, but McClellan was late returning home. He kept the president waiting, and when he finally got there, he just straight up went to bed. Now that's what I call disrespectful.
Wow.
McClellan talked the talk, but could he
If I was Abe, I would just immediately dismiss him. Like, after that, it shows that he can't be relied upon, and he's just a massive dick.
walk the walk? No. Like Lincoln's other generals, McClellan was maddeningly cautious. Hey man, could you move south and attack the enemy? What? Are you crazy? What if they have a big scary army down there? They probably do. What? Oh my gosh! McClellan worried that he did not have the numbers he needed to fight effectively.
Yeah,
What if they have,
he
like,
definitely doesn't have the
10,000 men?
numbers.
Okay, no problem. We'll get you 20.
The North outnumbers the South more than 2 to 1, and that's counting the slaves in the South. How could they possibly not muster the numbers needed to defeat the South?
20,000 men. Well, what if they have 30,000 men? I'll need 40.
Then you get
Okay,
40.
You can have 40. Well, what if they have 50? I'll need 60. Lincoln tried, but it was all in vain. McClellan would not make a move for the rest of the year. The North's one saving grace for now was a general out west fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee, General Ulysses S. Grant.
This is an oversimplified version of the events. I wonder if that guy is actually a traitor who's sympathetic to the South and that's why he's not moving. That's why he doesn't want to attack. Or maybe he thinks that the South will win, so he's hoping they give him a higher position once the South takes over, something like that maybe. Or maybe he's just a coward, or he just really has no idea what to do.
Cool, collected, methodical, and a big fan of whiskey. His chief of staff took it upon himself to keep Grant sober. One officer said that Grant habitually wore an expression as though he were determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And that determination led him to score a number of key victories when others around him were failing. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant was like, "Why does Stonewall Jackson get a cool nickname and I don't? I want a cool nickname." "Sir, the Confederates say they're ready to surrender and want to know your terms." "No terms, just unconditional surrender."
That's dumb.
Unconditional
Why would you say
surrender, Grant. That's a pretty cool nickname, right? Guys? Right? Later in April 1862, the Confederates launched a sudden attack on Grant's army at Shiloh, but the determined, unconditional surrender Grant threw his lines at the rebels and sent them running. The battle resulted in the heaviest casualties in U.S.
The northern states have been taking the most casualties so far. Although I guess that does make sense. They are the ones who are attacking, while the southern states are defending. So of course the northern states would have more losses.
history so far. And despite his victory, Grant found himself under fire. You have to get rid of Grant. Why? Didn't he win? Yes, but he just threw his men at the enemy. Isn't that the point? Also, he's a loony drunk.
You idiot.
Well, what does he like to drink? I believe whiskey, sir. Then send him more. Lincoln watched as his cabinet did nothing but bicker, and his generals did nothing. But then, worst of all,
replace them.
personal tragedy struck. Lincoln's young son, Willie, very much loved by the president, died of typhoid fever at the age of 11. Lincoln was a sensitive man and was heavily affected by the loss. His wife was inconsolable. But one of Lincoln's greatest traits, what made him such a great leader, was in the darkest of times, with composure and determination, he kept moving forward. He knew it was his responsibility to hold himself and his family together, and by doing so, he hoped to hold the nation together. And he had had it with McClellan's in action. Lincoln decided he was gonna take control. In March 1862, Lincoln firmly ordered McClellan to once again move south towards Richmond. McClellan insisted instead they move by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and attack Richmond from the southeast. Yes, said Lincoln. Okay, anything. Lincoln held on to
Just
some
do
of McClellan's
something at
men
this
to
point.
defend D.C. from a nearby Stonewall Jackson wreaking havoc in the Shenandoah Valley, and he sent McClellan south. McClellan landed on the peninsula, and he began to move inland. He came up against a small Confederate army that had dug in at Yorktown. McClellan vastly outnumbered the force, but it's said that Confederate General Magruder deceived McClellan by cleverly maneuvering his smaller force and making McClellan believe he faced a huge army. No, you have way more men than them. Move forward.
You know, honestly, if this wasn't about the whole slavery thing, I would be rooting for the southern states.
No. McClellan settled in for a month-long siege, giving time for Johnston to move south from Manassas and Magruder time to retreat. When he finally entered the city and found it deserted, he declared it a victory, calling his success brilliant. Then, after meeting some resistance at Williamsburg, McClellan moved to within just 20 miles of Richmond. His armies able to hear the church bells ringing in the enemy capital. You still outnumber them. Go give him hell. No. McClellan once again held back, moving slowly and defensively. And with his army split in two, the Confederates saw an opportunity to strike back. McClellan's advance was halted, and now the Confederates pulled an ace out of their sleeve. General Lee, you're up. Do you think we should evacuate Richmond? No, Mr. President. No need. General Robert E. Lee, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the time, was now in charge. One of his biggest strengths was his ability to read the mind of his enemy, and he knew McClellan was cautious and weak. After moving Stonewall Jackson south to join him, and even though he had a smaller army, Lee hit McClellan in a series of fast-paced, close combat battles that had McClellan spooked. McClellan retreated the Union Army back again and again and again, escaping the peninsula and returning
There's no
to
way
DC.
McClellan keeps his
Lee
position
had
after
defeated
this.
McClellan, and the campaign
He's definitely going to be
failed.
removed.
Well, that was a major success. A success? Tell me exactly what was successful about that. Well, we successfully retreated. You lost.
Nice.
I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. Things just kept looking worse for the North. At least their navy had seen some success, capturing a number of key port cities, notably when they steamrolled past Confederate forts to take New Orleans. And speaking of the navy, both sides had begun using ironclads. So that's pretty cool. But in the East, they still weren't having any luck. After McClellan's disastrous campaign, Lincoln briefly sent out one General John Pope to attack Northern Virginia. Hey man, just
Well,
checking
he's
in.
already
How's
done
it
better
going?
than McClellan.
Well, the Confederates kicked my butt at Cedar Mountain. Then they raided my
Never
cabin
mind.
and ran off with my money and clothes. Also, I appear to have been wedgied. Lee defeated Pope at yet another battle at Bull Run, in which nearby farm families once again got caught up in the fighting. Hurry up, Martha! There's another war out here! I'm waiting for my hair to dry! Wilmer McLean, sick of war, moved his family south, where he knew the war would definitely, absolutely, never
Well, it's
touch
gonna
him
be
again.
there soon.
But Lincoln had yet another problem to contend with. European powers, in particular the UK, were looking increasingly like they may intervene diplomatically on the side of the Confederates. They were missing their precious supply of southern cotton
Just
because of
like
the
I
Union
said
blockade,
before.
and they wanted to see a swift conclusion to the war. The tension between America and Great Britain had been increasing, especially after Confederate diplomats were discovered on a British ship. Now, after McClellan's failure to take Richmond, the UK declared it impossible for the North to win. Lincoln needed something to prevent Europe from getting involved, and after more petitioning from abolitionists, he decided maybe the time was finally right to make the war about ending the institution he hated, slavery. If the North had a noble cause to fight for, Europe would be less likely to intervene. But Lincoln and his cabinet knew before they could declare something as radical as emancipation, they needed a victory, especially now that the Confederates were about to go on
Need
the
some
attack.
victories for propaganda.
Aware that he had a limited number of men and supplies, Lee now hoped that if he could just threaten Washington, D.C. militarily, he would gain Europe's recognition and crush Northern morale in time for the midterm elections, forcing the North to negotiate. With confidence at an all-time high, for the first time, Robert E. Lee invaded the North. But on September 13th, the North finally had some luck. Oh boy, it's my lucky day. A cigar in a field. Hey, what's this wrapped around it? Oh my gosh! That's right. The North had discovered General Lee's battle plans wrapped around
How?
some cigars. And in them, they saw that Lee had split up his General Lee's battle
They
plans
wanted to
wrapped
go to
around
Mexico
some
again?
cigars. And in them, they saw that Lee had split up his forces. McClellan headed out from D.C., and the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam, a crucial battle that would decide the course of the war. It saw the most vicious fighting to date, and still remains the single bloodiest day in American history. But
So how
for
much?
once,
10,000
the North
deaths?
came
That's
out
it?
victorious, and Lee was forced to retreat. He's on the run. Chase him down and finish him off. No. American history.
Worse than 9/11, worse than D-Day and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Don't know how many people died in Pearl Harbor, but it definitely is below 10,000. 9/11 was how much? Like 3,000, I think? And D-Day, I don't know, like, how many Americans died during D-Day? Was it like 5K? See, I liked the fact that he says these are the highest single-day casualty numbers, but I would also like to know just how many actually did die. Like, I want to know the actual number, you know?
But for once, the North came out victorious, and Lee was forced to retreat. He's on the run. Chase him down and finish him off. No. You know what, old buddy, old pal?
Remove
You're
him.
fired. The North
Thank
had
you.
won their crucial
Took him
victory.
long enough.
Lincoln breathed a huge sigh of relief, and with that win, he was prepared to take a huge step. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In January, all slaves held in the Confederate States would be, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, officially free. Throughout the North, free black men and women rejoiced, knowing that if the North were to win, their brothers and sisters would no longer be held in bondage. The proclamation also had the intended effect on Europe, who were not willing to oppose a pledge to end slavery. An outraged Confederacy knew that Lincoln had given the war a new meaning. It was no longer just about the preservation of the Union. Now, it was about creating a new Union, washed clean of its original sin. A Union without slavery.
This really makes me think how much different the whole slavery thing would have gone if the North was actually winning from the very start. Because in the start, it wasn't about getting rid of slavery. It was just about stopping the spread and hoping it would slowly die out. It was all about just keeping the United States together, rather than having states just leaving the Union. Only at this point does it actually become about fighting, well, getting rid of slavery. Well, on to part 2.
As the Union struggle to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights after the war. Along the Mississippi,
They
General
actually
Ulysses
split.
S.
I would
Grant
think they'd
remained one
all
of the
joined
few
the
Union
North.
generals scoring major victories. With his best pal, General Sherman, by his side, Grant led his armies down the Mississippi to the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. Both sides knew that if
They're
Vicksburg
about to
fell,
split
the
them in
Confederacy
half.
would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city. But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south and take Richmond. Having given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. All right, Mr. President. Option 1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nutcase, but a good general.
Hooker.
Option 2, his qualifications are his name is Burnside.
Nah,
and he's
I'd
trained
choose
Hooker,
Hooker, yeah.
Say no more. So General Burnside was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and sent south. Lincoln
Those
hoped
are some
he
sick
finally had a
sideburns.
general who could succeed. Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river and take the city. But the Union War Department was too slow in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak. Hey, Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked? Yeah, right, Rebel. God
Some
is on
trash
our
talk
side.
before the
No
battle.
way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so? Well, why don't we ask him? Hey, God, whose side are you on?
Neither. He hates you both.
Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men, the Union Army finally launched their massive attack on the 11th of December. But by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces. During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong.
Imagine just
into a
running
brutal
at a
Confederate
wall
onslaught.
lined with
Even the
enemy
Confederates
soldiers
couldn't
just
believe
shooting
what
at
they were
you,
seeing. And in
seeing
one moment of
all the
camaraderie,
people next to you
Confederate
falling down,
sergeant,
dying.
unable to take it, reportedly came out into the field to tend to the Union wounded. Seeing this, the Union troops held their fire. Still, Burnside and his
I mean,
forces
makes
were
sense.
soundly
They're all
defeated at
Americans.
Fredericksburg and forced to retreat.
They
Lincoln's
don't
popularity
want to
and
fight each
Northern
other.
morale
I would
continued
assume so
to
anyway.
plummet, especially as the winter heading into 1863
Because it's
was
like,
bad.
you're
The
killing
winter
your own
camps were
people.
rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both sides, men began to leave. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm deserting.
He's deserting.
What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can. Lincoln, ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my, here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence, or he'll be suspended tomorrow. What? To try to keep the numbers
It
up,
was a
both
good
sides
joke.
had introduced conscription. There was controversy in the North, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else fight on their behalf. Riots broke out in New York City with enraged
I mean,
mobs
do you
furious
blame
at
them?
the idea of going to fight for slaves, an idea that many of them simply did not support. However, after so much pressure,
I mean, think about it. Do you want to go to war? No. If you had the ability to pay someone else to go for you, would you do it? Most people would probably say yes. Because I doubt there's many people who actually want to go to war. And the fact these people don't want to go to fight for the slaves also makes perfect sense, because that's not their problem. Why should they go fight for it? It's conscription. They have no choice. It's like someone comes to you and says, you're gonna go fight for those people now. You don't care about them. You're not interested in the slightest, but you have to go fight. You're forced to do it. Of course they're not going to want to. I wouldn't. I'll happily admit I wouldn't fight for them. Fuck that. I'm not going to war for some other people I don't care about. Yeah, they're slaves. Sucks. But not my problem. I'm not gonna go die. I should probably clarify that I'm not racist. I just wouldn't go fight for them. For anybody, to be honest. Other than my own country. Like, if a foreign power was invading my country and I was drafted, then I'd go. But that's because it's my country. I'm not fighting for anybody else. Or anything else.
the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist. And these men, knowing what they were fighting for, signed up.
Yeah,
By
see,
the end of
them
the war,
going actually
nearly
makes
200,000
sense.
troops, 10%
Because
of
they're
the
fighting
Union
for
Army,
their
were
rights.
black. The valor and bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics. Okay, well that last guy was useless. Let's try this Hooker fella. General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again, Lincoln ordered him to move south and take Richmond. Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men Lee did. Lee was forced to defy all military convention and split his smaller force into two. Lee had absolutely no chance of winning, and Lee won. It was his
How?
masterpiece. Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle, though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops,
Wait, but
unable
those
to
are Confederate.
recognize him, opened fire.
Are you serious?
You boys done goofed up. Jackson died 8 days later. As for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it. It was yet another loss, and Northern...
I don't know, but in that kind of situation, think about it. You have multiple people. All of you have guns. What's approaching you is just one horse, one guy. Couldn't you just wait a little bit?
support continued to
And
waver.
assess the
While the
situation?
Union kept on struggling in the east, out west, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always. In an attempt to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi. Aware that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's supply line and defending his rear from Confederate armies in Jackson. Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored. Despite not taking the city, Lincoln
So it's
loved
time
it
to drink.
and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own
Oh
state.
yeah,
They
that's
could
why we
named
have
it
West
anything
Virginia.
in the world, but the creative minds at the time came up with the ingenious West Virginia. Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command. Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia with a mustache. E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot? So General Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it was a crucial time for the Union, because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack. So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily, but as the war kept going, the Confederate economy
Yeah, the
was
economy is
crumbling.
definitely taking a
Riots
hit.
broke out in the streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling. Jefferson Davis wanted to send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances
Yeah,
got.
you gotta
And he
take
still hoped
Washington.
If he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863, with the momentum behind him, General Lee once
No,
again
why
entered the
threaten them?
North,
Go full
fighting
out.
his way
Just
through Maryland and
take
into
DC.
Pennsylvania. General Meade set out to meet him for what would be the most significant
definitely
battle
wouldn't be an
of
easy
the
task,
entire
but-
war. If the Confederates won, DC
I mean,
could fall. If the Union
I
won,
think he could
it
do
would
it.
be a turning
Well,
point,
he
as
could
the
have.
Confederates would run out of steam, and the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 1st, units from each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself. The townspeople were forced to take refuge, except for one man who reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. "Joseph, what are you doing?" "I'm not gonna let them take my beans." "How many times do I have to tell you they're not here for your beans?" By the second day, over 100,000 men stretched for miles across the battlefield. Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's disorganized left. But Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge, smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back.
They got
The Union
incredibly
forces held
lucky.
across the line. On the final day, Lee believed the Union Army had fortified its flanks, so he decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. The Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General
Oh,
Pickett's
that's not
charge.
gonna pay off
This
for
time,
him.
it
That's
was
not
the
gonna
Union's
work.
turn to unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee. A devastated General Lee called out to his fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never came,
I
he
mean,
ordered a retreat
yeah,
back into Virginia.
guess it kinda was.
The North had just managed to score a massive victory, and one they desperately needed. And if that wasn't enough,
I mean, at
in
least
the
he can
West,
admit
after
it.
a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee. He suffered a major setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga, and ended up under a Confederate siege at Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could be recovered. And often in the Civil
yeah,
War, during these small
that's good.
truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee, and maybe even
Makes sense.
honey.
Once again, they're
Do
all
you like
American.
honey? Me too.
It's
These
just an
are
ad,
great.
okay.
And you
I
know
take back what I
brings me?
said.
Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of all Western Union armies, showed up and karate kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this. With Sherman
is
and
with his
Hooker,
face?
Grant took on Confederate positions in the mountains around the city, including the famous battle above the clouds and Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally turning. Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been
I'm
turned
just
into
kind
a
of waiting
hospital
for Grant
care
to
for the
mess up
scores of wounded
finally.
men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion doing crucial work on the home front, and volunteering as nurses for those who had given their lives. A new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward
Jesus,
to give some
that's a lot of
brief,
yapping.
appropriate remarks. In just 2 minutes, he masterfully and poignantly iterated America's national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. While they were now making progress, the North still couldn't find a decisive victory in the East. And that was bad news for Lincoln, because his presidency was now in its 4th year. In 1864, there was an election coming. The Confederates knew this
He's gonna
too,
need some
and with
massive
little hope
victory.
left of being able to threaten the North
And so
militarily,
will they.
believed their last shot at
To make
victory
sure people
may
don't
be
vote for
in
Lincoln.
the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just hold out and continue to inflict more defeats,
Could
the
black
of the
people
North would
vote at this
Lincoln
point
out
in time?
and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate. Lincoln knew now he desperately needed a victory.
Because if they could,
Now,
then
I know
Lincoln's
what
gonna
you think,
have at least
but
a couple of million
oversimplified.
easy
If
votes.
Lincoln loves General Grant so much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East? Well, guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail on the head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you that. I'm promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted. Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish.
Please stop with the
So
grant
Grant was
puns.
put in charge, and he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all fronts, with General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1864, that plan went into action. Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against the smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford
What is
Forrest,
that?
was also nearby, doing his best to threaten funniest
What is that face? Good lord.
Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest,
Looks
was also
horrifying.
nearby,
That's gonna
doing his
haunt my,
best to threaten
haunt my
Sherman's
dreams
advance.
for the
But
next
in a
couple of
series
months
battles,
at least.
Sherman dominated and pushed Johnson back to the city, but he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, the main show was happening to the east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederacies. Lincoln hoped Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater. And
Who's
bring
gonna
something
win?
new. He did. As Grant began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted heavy casualties, hoping to demoralize the North as much as he could. But here's what set Grant apart from others.
He's just
He
gonna
knew
keep
Lee was
pushing.
running out of men, and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward
Yeah,
and
just
flank
keep
Lee
going.
again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing.
God.
In DC, Grant was criticized for being a men
Wait.
would be
Now this is killed, wounded, or missing. It's not just killed. Okay, so I'm guessing that probably only like, let's say 20,000 and 15,000 were killed while the rest is wounded or missing. Maybe even less killed.
killed, wounded, or missing. In DC, Grant was criticized for being a butcher. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union casualties were so heavy that Grant reportedly began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond. Lee knew once he got there,
I'm assuming Grant is gonna win it. He's gonna take Richmond, and that's gonna be pretty much it. So those 50,000 casualties, completely worth it. I see no problem with that. If the war had dragged on for another couple of years, more people than that would have died. So honestly, this is an absolute win.
He'd
Screw
be
the
under
50,000
siege.
casualties.
Then it would only be a matter of time. Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor. Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital and cut its supply line. But, just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city, and he too was forced to settle in for a siege. 2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North
Yeah,
saw the
he
casualties
needs a
Grant had been
win.
taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten DC, with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from
Oh,
Richmond.
never
Early was
mind.
repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate,
did push them
who
back.
was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical 1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby? I'm back. That's right.
No
General
way.
George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln.
This
My
bitch came
fellow
back?
countrymen, If you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war.
It's going to be a
Unlike
landslide
this
victory for
douchebag, many
Lincoln,
Democrats,
I'm
however,
guessing.
including McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Well, fret not, Abe, because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get. Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most important cities, had fallen into Union hands. For many,
that's
it
a
was
major
clear
win.
that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over.
So it's
When
time
the
to
final
switch
results
sides.
came in, Lincoln had won with an electoral college
Wow,
landslide.
it is a
With the
landslide.
troops in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. In January, Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress. In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation. Black men and women, watching the vote from the galleries, knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later, at his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized the need for
Did he get shot
reunification
before
and
the war
binding up
ended or
wounds.
after?
To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had no interest in
John Wilkes
reunification.
Booth.
John
That's what he
Wilkes
was called,
Booth,
right?
an actor living in
Yeah,
D.C.,
it is.
was also a deep Southern sympathizer. And as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate, he was already plotting his revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point who would win. But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated to see the conflict being dragged out. Why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing
Desperation?
the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept
Denial?
that an army could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses. Sherman decided to do something unprecedented. He would remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land.
Oh, they
There,
would,
they
yeah,
would wreak havoc.
they would live off
As
the
they
land.
marched, they tore up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines. They also liberated thousands of slaves. The damage done was estimated at $1.4 billion.
1.4
The tactics
billion.
were cruel, but to Sherman, it was better than losing yet more men in battle. In December, he reached
Yeah, that's
Savannah,
fact.
Georgia, but he
It's
wasn't
war.
done
War
yet.
is cruel. Who
Next,
cares?
He turned north to inflict his punishment.
This is
on
the
first
type of
state
stuff you should
secede,
expect.
South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to break through
How
took
many?
2 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted.
60,000
Numerous Union
men
attempts to
deserted.
break through had failed, but when the breakthrough finally came, it came quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last time, right? Sorry,
Oh
can't
no,
hear you.
it's over.
Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond was evacuated, and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left, the Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burnt out of control, and as the Union troops arrived,
Oh,
they
no.
became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, where he trapped his forces. It was here,
Oh, that's where
on
that guy
April 9th,
went.
1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir? Listen, bub. I drank a bit too much last night, and now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it. General
The
Lee
enemy
says he
wants to surrender.
Hot diggity dog! Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family, owned by a man who had tried his best to escape the
Yep.
Civil War years
It's
earlier.
that guy again.
Wilmer McLean. All right, can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha, not now! I'm cleaning. Do you want us to get rats? Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. He knew that now was the time for reconciliation. Just over 2 weeks later, General Johnson would surrender to Sherman, ending the war for 89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang
They were
out
still
and
holding out hope
celebrations erupted.
for a win?
In Washington, Lincoln gave a
Something?
speech from the White House to a jubilant crowd, in which, among various
So
things,
at what point does
expressed
he
his
get
support
shot?
for black voting rights. Lincoln had seen the nation through its deepest crisis. The presidency had visibly aged him. He had lost over 20 pounds. He said sometimes, "I think I am the tiredest man on earth." I'm not sure tiredest is a word, but geez, the man's exhausted. Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently
Yeah,
very cheerful,
no, he's
surprising
gonna
his
get
wife,
shot.
and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln attended a play with his
And
wife
this
and
is where
some
he
friends
dies.
at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses of brandy. He slipped quietly into the president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise. The president was shot in the back of the head.
How is it that he was able to get in there? It was the booth that the president was in. Surely there should have at least been someone guarding it, right? I mean, he's at war. There's still an active war going on. Yes, it's almost over, but the risk of him being assassinated was still there. Surely he had to have some guards, right? He couldn't just leave himself exposed like that, but I guess he did.
Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken
Yeah,
wife,
no shit, he was
son,
shot in the
and
back of the
members
head.
Cabinet. At 7:22 the next morning, President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered. A shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years, he was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued into May, when the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated. The Southern states came under Northern military occupation
Texas held
to
out the
prevent
longest.
any further rebellion, and a very difficult era of Reconstruction began. Over 3 million Americans had fought, brother against brother. The Civil War.
750 killed, 2/3 from disease, so 500,000 died from disease. Only 250 actually from fighting, and around 50,000 civilians plus 80,000 slaves. Not even a million. I thought it was way more than that.
Remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. But the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners were those who were to never again be slaves. Further amendments passed by Congress gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote. Significant progress had been made. However, entering into the 20th century, it was clear the fight for equality would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up in the darkest of times stands as a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage. A continuous reminder of what has forged America and what it should ever strive to be.
Yeah, the casualty numbers were a lot lower than I expected. I thought they would be at least over 1 million. Well, they only reached 750,000. I mean, I guess that's good. The less dead people, the better. So yeah, the war started because Lincoln wanted to keep the Union together, but then, because the Europeans were about to be involved, they chose racism, getting rid of slavery, as the reason for the war. It was never really about slavery in the first place. I mean, I guess he did want to stop the spread of it, but he wasn't about to just completely get rid of it. Not until he needed to, so that the Europeans wouldn't get involved in the war. Yeah, I learned quite a bit of stuff I didn't know about US history today. I know that most of it wasn't really in-depth and detailed, but I did learn some stuff. If I've offended any Americans watching, sorry. Don't know what else to tell you, just sorry, I guess. And that's all I got to say. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you're interested, why not watch this video right here? And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.